Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. I want to go ahead and get Series 7 of today's Tolkien Times underway, and we've got a change or two to talk about this time around. First, I'm going to be setting aside my read-through of the Lay of Lathian on First Age Fridays as I return to Fandom Fridays for the next 8 weeks. But I will be continuing the Second Age Saturdays as I finish our read-through of Aldarion and Arendis. Tolkien Tuesdays, Word Nerd Wednesdays, and Third Age Thursdays remain the same. But this series, the mailbag is looking a little empty, so I'm doing a new Monday segment, Map Monday, or Middle-earth Map Monday if you'll allow additional alliteration. Each week, I'm going to take a look at a region or town or fortress or something on the map and talk about its history, its meaning, its etymology, and anything else that comes to mind. And for this set of 8 episodes, I'm going to be keeping my focus on the north of Middle-earth. So we're going to start today with the most familiar place of all on the map, the Shire. Now, first, let's talk about the name itself. Not surprisingly, Shire is the modern equivalent of Old English Shir, S-C-I-R, meaning administrative district or jurisdiction. In Anglo-Saxon times, the Shire was the typical administrative division of the kingdom, the local government, if you will. England was divided into shires the way that it's now divided into counties. And in fact, this is interesting, they started as 2 words for the exact same thing. When the Normans conquered England, boo, they used the French word comté, county, the realm of a count, to translate the Old English word shire. By the 14th century, county replaced the word shire in everyday use, but it does still exist as seen in various place names. Many of the modern counties of England, as well as Scotland and Wales, still have shire in their names, such as Oxfordshire, Lancashire, and Yorkshire. Now, as to its history, the Shire, as we now know it, was founded by the brothers Marco and Blanco in Third Age 1601. Now, I want to place that in the wider history. The Gondorian kinstrife took place a little less than 200 years before, between 1432 and 1437. That was down in the south. Meanwhile, there in the north, the former kingdoms of Arnor were in trouble by 1601. By that point, Rhudaur had been occupied by evil men subject to Angmar for more than 200 years, while Cardolan still had some people, but their last prince had been killed in 1409. Arthedain was the only one of those 3 still remaining intact, and it was their 10th king, Argeleb II, who gave Marco and Blanco permission to settle in the region. Those names, by the way, are both related to words for horse. Marco contains the Gothic element march, which corresponds to Old English mer, as in meras, while Blanco's name comes from Old English blanca, meaning white or gray horse. More on them some other time, perhaps. Now, I'm going to read from the prologue on the beginnings of the Shire. The Fallowhide brothers, Marco and Blanco, set out from Bree, and having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost, that's Argeleb II, they crossed the brown river Branduin with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone bows that had been built in the days of the power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Not a bad deal, I'd say. Now, over the next 30 years, they, meaning the Harfoots that had been led by the Fallowhide brothers Marco and Blanco, they were joined by Stewars that had been migrating up from Dunlin. That's the 3rd branch of the hobbits. Now, the hobbits of the Shire did, in general, survive the Great Plague, even though it hit just 36 years after the Shire's founding. But the Tale of Years does say that they suffered great loss during that plague, as so many other peoples did. Now back to that timeline, it would be another 300 years later when Arthedain, the last of the surviving kingdoms of the north, was destroyed. Now, later events in the Shire include the invasion of the goblins and the Battle of the Greenfields, that was in Third Age 2747, as well as the Long Winter in 2758, and the Fell Winter in 2911, when White Wolves invaded the Shire. That would be a little more than 100 years before the start of The Lord of the Rings. Now, after the fall of Arnor, the Shire was politically independent. It was nominally led by the Thane, but his role was primarily ceremonial in nature. The only elected official was the mayor of Mitchell Delving, who was in charge of the Watch and the Messengers and elected every 7 years. Now, geographically, Tolkien tells us 40 leagues it stretched from the Far Downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes in the south. Now that's 120 miles wide and 150 miles from north to south. In his complete guide to Middle-earth, Robert Foster says the Shire encompasses about 18,000 square miles, while in her Atlas of Middle-earth, Karen Wynne Fodstad estimates it as a little bit larger, 21,400 square miles. Now, if it were a U.S. state, it would only be the 42nd largest, behind West Virginia and ahead of Maryland and Massachusetts. And it's less than half the size of England. However, Tolkien certainly suggests its association with England when he writes, "Those days, the Third Age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has been changed. But the regions in which the hobbits then lived were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the old world, east of the sea." Now, of course, he confirms that connection in letter 294, where he writes, "The action of the story takes place in the northwest of Middle-earth, equivalent in latitude to the coastlands of Europe and the north shores of the Mediterranean. If Hobbiton and Rivendell are taken as intended," Tolkien writes, "to be at about the latitude of Oxford, then Minas Tirith, 600 miles south, is at about the latitude of Florence." Now, once settled, the hobbits, according to Tolkien's prologue, fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, and soon passed once more out of the history of men and of elves. Not surprisingly, because we read later in that paragraph, the land was rich and kindly, and though it had long been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king had once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. Now, a quick note on cornlands. I think I've talked about this here on the TTT before, maybe not. It is certainly something that we've talked about on the PPP, but corn doesn't always mean what we here in the U.S. think of today when we think of corn, the long ears that grow on tall stalks and that go great next to a steak on the grill. That's maize. Now, corn, as Tolkien refers to it, is simply the grain of a cereal grass that is the primary crop of a region. So like wheat in England or barley in Scotland. So whether it was wheat or oats or barley, the Shire was a rich agricultural land. Now, the Shire would, during its history, expand twice. The first expansion was onto the small sliver of land between the Old Forest and the east side of the Brandywine River. According to the Tale of Years, the Old Bucks occupied the Buckland in 2340. Now that's more than 700 years after the founding of the Shire, but also nearly 700 years before the time of the Lord of the Rings. And we read a little about this in the chapter A Conspiracy Unmasked. Long ago, Gorhindad Oldbuck, head of the Oldbuck family, one of the oldest in the Marish, or indeed in the Shire, had crossed the river, which was the original boundary of the land eastwards. He built and excavated Brandy Hall, changed his name to Brandybuck, and settled down to become master of what was virtually a small independent country. That was the origin of Buckland, a thickly inhabited strip between the river and the Old Forest, a sort of colony from the Shire. Its chief village was Bucklebury, clustering in the banks and slopes behind Brandy Hall. Now, the second expansion of the Shire doesn't actually take place until after the Lord of the Rings, in Fourth Age 31. That's when we read in the Tale of Years that the West March, from the far downs to the Tower Hills, Emin Beraid, is added to the Shire by the gift of the king. Now that would be King Elessar, who you might remember better as Aragorn. And folks, that wraps it up for Middle-earth Map Monday. But if you have a mailbag question you'd like me to answer next series, please email it to barlaman@theprancingponypodcast.com. In fact, please do. The reason I'm covering maps this series is because Barlaman's bag is nearly empty. So send it in and let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times. I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. And come back next week as I take a look at the Old Forest. Now, if you'd like to help me keep making this show better, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to find out how you can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.